channel. It is now December, which means the mini-series that was going on in November, which was all solved cases, is now gone and needs to make way for a new mini-series. And I know you guys have been anxiously waiting to find out what this mini-series is. The month of December is the month of Jane and John Doe cases. So before I dig any deeper into this, I want to explain what a Jane or a John Doe is. I didn't know that people weren't aware of the term and didn't know what it meant until my last video that I did, Orange Socks and Walker County Jane Doe. So I wanted to go ahead and explain that. Basically, a Jane or a John Doe is an unidentified person. So they actually could be alive or they could be deceased, and no one knows who they are. No one's come forward to claim them. And they pretty much are just nameless. There aren't many cases where there is a live Jane or John Doe. Those are few and far between, so most of them are cases, unfortunately, where a person has been found deceased, whether it's from homicide or just natural causes, and that's usually what happens in a Jane or a John Doe case. I think it's incredibly important to spread these cases, and there are literally people who work for hours and hours during the day to try to match these unidentified people to missing persons posters. That is frequently how these unidentified people become identified, is from the work of all these people endlessly searching. And it's so incredibly crazy that someone could, you know, show up deceased and no one come and claim them. Does that mean no one was looking for them to begin with? It's a whole bizarre world that I really didn't know existed until I did my last video on it. So let's go ahead and jump into the first one. So today's video is on the Dorado Jane Doe, and this is one of the most popular Jane Doe cases. It's one of the first ones that pops up on Google. It is in so many different lists of the top craziest Jane Doe stories, and there's a pretty good reason as to why. So most Jane and John Doe cases, the person's unidentified and they really have no past on this person. Usually it's someone that has just flown under the radar, no one knew them, no one heard of them. They weren't found for sometimes up to months after they had died. But this is the exact opposite, so it's not really what you would expect with a Jane Doe case. The Dorado Jane Doe is an unidentified American woman thought to be between 18 and 30 years of age. In my searching, I found discrepancies in that. Some sites said that she was between like 20 and 30, others were like 16 and 30. And honestly, that is quite the large age gap, and it's kind of hard to determine if you were to look at her picture, at least it was for me, how old you think she is. So I understand why that gap is there. She was between 5'10" and 5'11" and weighed roughly between 150 and 165 pounds. She had blue eyes and brown hair at the time of her death, but in a lot of the pictures found of her, she usually bleached her hair blonde, and then there's even people who have followed her case for such a long time that are absolutely convinced her natural hair wasn't brown, but it was actually red, based on post-mortem pictures, which I can kind of see, but also the photography at that time wasn't the best, so it could just be the way the picture was taken. She had a small birthmark or scar under her left breast, and she had a couple of different scars on her face, but none of them would have been like enough to stand out and really get someone's attention. She also had quite a lot of freckles and 3 piercings in her left ear and 2 on her right, but those are the main things really identifying her physically. Unfortunately, Dorado Jane Doe was murdered on July 10th, 1991 in El Dorado, Arkansas in room 121 of the Whitehall Motel, and she had been murdered by her ex-boyfriend, James McAlpin. There were multiple witnesses to her murder, and many people saw James McAlpin, so it wasn't really a question of who killed her, but more of who exactly is she. It made it even weirder when they started trying to figure out who she was. So obviously when someone is murdered, they're going to try to find out who this person is to inform the family. And when they searched her belongings, they found an ID with the name Cheryl Ann Wick. It had her picture on it, it looked like her, there was even a social security card with the same name on it, so that's who they assumed this girl was. They tracked her and her family to Minnesota and gave the family a phone call to inform them that unfortunately their daughter had been murdered, only to be given the phone number for the real Cheryl Ann Wick, who informed them that she was very alive and well. Whoever this girl was had stolen Cheryl Ann Wick's identity. The real Cheryl had been a dancer for a while, and she thinks that during that time her social security card was stolen out of her wallet. She took everything with her in her wallet. She said she knew it wasn't a very smart thing, and she honestly hadn't even realized it was gone. But she knows the last time she had it was when she was a dancer, and that's the last time she really saw it. So they went to James McAlpin to try to find out who this girl was, and he told them that he knew her as Mercedes. He was not just her ex-boyfriend, but he was also her alleged pimp, and that's where her whole entire crazy story really starts. He found out she had been living by multiple names, and if I'm looking over here, it's just to recite them. So Mercedes, as we know, Cheryl Ann Wick, as we know, Kelly Lee Carr, Shannon Wiley, Cheryl Kaufman, and Sharon Wiley. She used all of these names frequently, however, not a single one of them was her actual name. She lived in multiple states such as Texas, Louisiana. She had been tracked to Virginia for some point. There are even ties to Florida. Basically, all over the East Coast and then over to Texas was where she bounced around from. They actually found many different arrest records that had the name Cheryl Ann Wick, which this girl had been using. She was arrested in Dallas, Texas on December 31st, 1990, and then again on January 26th, 1991, at the same location, both times for prostitution. Then in Garland, Texas, she was arrested on February 8th, 1991, and then again in May 1991, she was arrested for bad checks in El Dorado, Arkansas, which was the last place that she would be seen before she was murdered. All the time she had been arrested, she had used the name Cheryl Ann Wick, and that's the only reason they were able to even track where she had been, and that still left a lot of questions as to all the other places she could have gone. Many people started coming forward claiming to know her, and they actually had a lot of pieces of her story, but the only problem was no one could really tell if any of them were true because she told everybody interestingly different stories. She claimed to have grown up with the Fort Worth Three, which were three girls that were taken from a mall and then placed to a sex ring. So she had been on her own and stuck in that lifestyle from a pretty young age. She bounced around to many different people, and eventually she went from being forced into this sort of lifestyle to choosing it as an adult, or at least that's what everybody said. After bouncing around from a few different pimps, she ended up with James. She dated James for about a year, and it was never a good relationship. I mean, I wouldn't really expect anything differently from a woman dating a pimp. She was in and out of the hospital after being beaten by him, and eventually she gathered the courage to leave him, and she fled to stay with her friend Andrea. After leaving James and staying with Andrea, he still tried to contact her over and over and over again. She never responded, and then finally, at one point, he somehow convinced her to come over to the Whitehall Motel, which is where he was staying temporarily. He offered her some amount of money, and that's the only way he got her over there. And when she went over there, that's when the heated argument began that would eventually lead to her murder. And at one point, a neighbor named Roy Menon came over and he knocked on the door. He needed to get some tapes back, and she was actually the one who answered. And I'm just going to refer to her as Mercedes from here on out. It's a little bit easier to refer to her as that. She said to him, "You need to talk to James," and then she tried to get past him to leave. At that point, James came, hit her, grabbed her, and then physically drug her back into the apartment. Obviously, that's going to freak Roy out a little bit, so he went and locked himself back in his room, and he claims that he heard a little bit more arguing, and then there was one gunshot. At this point, there are multiple witnesses who saw James fleeing the scene, like booking it out of this motel. He was eventually charged with second-degree murder and thrown in prison, and they kind of hoped he could help lead to any sort of information about this girl. But after all, the person they thought she was turned out to just be a stolen identity of another person that had never even met her. People started coming forward to try to help them piece together the puzzle of who Mercedes was, and they all had very, very different stories. She told her friend Andrea, the one that she had been living with, that she was a stripper from out of town and she had 2 children that were being taken care of by her mother. But her and her mother didn't have a good relationship, so she couldn't go and see them, and she was just working whatever job she could to send them money. She told some people she was in the witness protection program because her father was in the mafia, and she even told other people she was wanted because of a string of robberies along the East Coast that she had been involved in. She then told a bunch of people that she was used as a lure in a bunch of different truck stop robberies. She basically was dropped off at a truck stop, lured these truck drivers in, and then they were robbed, and she even told some people one of these robberies ended in murder. Police were even able to possibly connect her to an unsolved murder of a man in the area. She told a volunteer at the Salvation Army that she lived at this very specific address in Dallas, Texas, but when that was checked out, it was found that it was actually a homeless shelter, and it wasn't actually a house or a location she would have lived at. She also told this woman that she had a daughter she was unable to regain custody of because she had changed her name. The people who met her said she was extremely timid and she always acted like she was running away from something. She always had wads of cash with her. They found minis in her possession from Virginia and from Texas, just really random things, and nothing really pinpointed back to a very specific place that she might have lived. They even found a Bible that had family members with the last name Stroud inscribed on it. I'm going to read off a list of those different names that they saw in the book. There was a Willie James Stroud, a Sharon Yvette Stroud, a LaDonna Elaine Stroud, Johnny Lee Stroud, Viola Elizabeth Ross Stroud, Donna Jean Stroud, and Bobby Jones Stroud. They were hoping that that possibly was the link to her name. Maybe her real name was Stroud and that was the one heirloom that she kept with her, because it seemed like a very personal thing. You know, it was a Bible, it had engravings on it. However, when they looked into it, it led them to an absolute dead end yet again. So even with all these different stories and all these different things they found on her, everything seemed to be made up. Every story was a little bit different. Every story had a different town in it, a different state in it, a different amount of children in it, different reason in it. So it almost seemed as if she was going around and purposely making up these lies in hopes that her true identity never came to light. Then James started speaking, and he claimed that he knew her true identity, which to some people is a big load of crap. He started giving them little bits of information, but refused to give anyone her full name or where her mother lived that he claimed he knew without someone giving him $4,000. So basically, he claimed he would tell the police all of this information for this very small amount of money. But the one thing he did say was that giving them this information would not only solve the cold case of who the Dorado Jane Doe was, but it would also solve a whole other string of cold cases. So obviously this got the police's attention. He told them that she had been on the streets since she was about 16 years old. So keep in mind, they assumed she was between 18 and 30. He said she fell in love with a man who ended up forcing her into a sex ring in Dallas, Texas. This is where she claimed to have met the Fort Worth Three. Dallas and Fort Worth are pretty close to each other, and they basically became sisters and best friends until it became apparent that most of the girls in the sex ring were being taken to Mexico. Once again, this is where she kind of befriended people and really stood out to her pimps. She did exactly what they said to do to keep herself safe. This is where she eventually met James. He claimed that she hid her true identity because the people she left behind would be very embarrassed by her lifestyle. I find that a little bit strange, because if she was, you know, taken away from home, which is one of the things that she claimed, and forced into a sex ring, I feel like that's not really something that would be her fault. That's not really anything to be embarrassed about. However, you know, we all know that usually people that are taken feel guilty in one way, shape, or form. You know, victims of sexual assault usually feel guilty, so that's not that alarming, but something about that does sound kind of off. He said that when he met her, she did in fact have 2 children and that they were left in Fort Worth. And he also said that some of her family lived in Florida, but again, wouldn't give out exact locations, names, nothing. The detectives eventually ruled that he had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He was just doing this for his own gain. He kept asking for very bizarre things with the money, like music players, and, you know, he kept changing the amounts. He would keep lowering it and lowering it and lowering it. I will link all of the different letters where he admitted all this stuff down below. And then eventually he wanted pretty much no money. And then eventually after that, he said that he actually didn't have any information. So basically, all of this important information that they got and they checked out led to nothing, and it's very possible it's because he made it up or she made it up. You know, they had DNA, they had fingerprints, they had really questionable bits of history, but somehow they were not able to identify who this woman really was, and not a single person came forward. There are so many different theories as to who she is. James is not a very good person to look at. I think he lied the entire time. I don't think he really knows anything. When I was looking at his letters myself, you know, he changed his story up a couple times. At one point he even said, "We dropped the children off." So I mean, I don't know, you know, he would know where they were if he was there when they dropped them off. I think he basically was just creating all these different stories and making things up in hopes that it would eventually better his situation. He had a huge list of criminal infractions. Most of them involved some sort of violence towards women or just someone in general. A lot of different assaults were on there, so I don't really think he's the best person to believe. However, she's proven as well that you can't really believe what she said either. Told all these different stories. It's really difficult to pinpoint who she was, which is incredibly frustrating. So to know that there is so much information that could just all be fake and a lie is very, very interesting and something you don't see very often. Based on the information I've seen and the fact that no one came forward for her, I don't ever think there was a missing persons report put out for her. The people that have gone through NamUs and all those different places have found some people that could possibly be her, but honestly, if she was in that database, I feel like with how publicized her case was and how much attention it did get because it was so different, someone probably would have come forward. That doesn't mean that there's no one out there who would claim her and maybe the person just doesn't know. However, to me, I feel like she would have been found by now. Like I said, it's one of the first people that pop up on Google when you search Jane Doe. She was on the streets at the age of 16, like James said, which again could be completely a lie. I'm assuming she was probably closer to the age of 30. I think from her looks, she definitely looks between 25 and 30 to me. But again, I'm not like the absolute best at determining age. The one thing that makes me think that in particular though, is that she managed to stay safe for an extended period of time, and she kind of managed to jump around from pimp to pimp and for at least a good while keep herself relatively safe and out of some of the more dangerous sides of a sex ring and prostitution. So to me, that kind of indicates like she had been in the lifestyle for quite some time. I personally think that she might have had a bad childhood. I think it was a really rough start for her. I think it's very possible she chose to leave home on her own. You know, in that case, it would make sense as to why no one's come forward and identified her. Maybe these people didn't really care to begin with. Maybe that's exactly why she ended up on the streets. Maybe that's why she ended up never going home even as she became adult and chose the lifestyle herself. Could be another huge reason as to why she hid her identity. While she does link back possibly to quite a few different crimes, it seems like she had been hiding her identity for a very long time, so maybe she ran away on purpose, and then in order to stay away because she never planned on returning, she hid her identity. She picked up any identity she could, used any made-up name she could so that there was no way she could possibly be tracked. Or, on the other hand, maybe she was just involved in a ton of crimes, and in order to keep herself out of jail and possibly being found out, that's why she hid her identity. It just seems very well thought out, very well planned. She managed to have this identity for a very long time. She used it for a very long time. And it seems like, given the circumstances, she was able to really take advantage of every situation she was in order to keep herself safe and protect herself. So I feel like it was probably a sad circumstance of just not a good home life and her kind of growing up in similar situations that led her to be so successful. And I hate to even say that because she did end up murdered, but most people living that sort of lifestyle and being involved in that world, don't have it as good as she had it. And I still hate even saying that, but I know you guys will know what I'm saying. I think this was a very familiar world to her. I think she knew exactly how to play the game, and that's why she was able to stay safe for as long as she was. I just don't understand how someone could just not have anyone claim them. That's just not a concept that's very easy for me to grasp. So I'm interested to see what you guys think. Do you think there's really someone out there who knows her and maybe is embarrassed about the past that they found out she ended up having and that's why they won't claim her? Or do you think that whoever could be out there to claim her just doesn't really want to and that's why she ended up in the situation she was in to begin with? Let me know what you guys think down below. I just think with Jane and John Doe cases, the best thing you can do is get out any bit of information you possibly can, physical appearance, pictures of them, just anything in hopes that the right person sees them. Keep in mind as well, it wasn't just parents that saw these people or siblings that saw these people. At some point, neighbors possibly, or schools. You know, there's not just a family that sees these people, and I think that's what we tend to forget when we think of families not coming and claiming them. It's not just families. They grew up around someone, they went to school with someone. There's lots of people out there who could possibly know something. So if you recognize that this woman, if you know her in any way, shape, or form, if you think she looks familiar, I've got all the information listed down below so you can contact someone. I feel like Jane and John Does are often forgotten, which is extremely heartbreaking, but there could possibly be someone out there who cared about them that just has no idea what happened to them. So let's see if we can get these people circulating. I'm excited for the month of Jane and John Does, and I hope you guys are too. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and go. Please check out all of my social media sites I've got listed down below. Hit that subscribe button to become a member of the family, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.